Whenever I sell a vintage watch, I come across the classic comment from many people saying that, the 36mm watch is very small, is for ladies. But, curiously, in the 60s, a 34, 36mm watch was huge. Obviously, in those times, the daily attire was to wear a suit with an elegant tie, and obviously you had to have a watch that matched the elegance. A watch that was simple, elegant, slim, and above all, small, so it could fit on your shirt cuff. Obviously, times are evolving, products are changing, and around the 90s and 2000s, the trend became for watches to become larger. And brands like Tag and Breitling went to the other side by releasing huge watches of 45, 50mm, full of diamonds, really big watches. Which obviously is the other spectrum, where we go from 34mm watches to watches that are almost twice the size. But I mean, we all know the 90s and the 2000s were very strange times. But now, the size of watches has gradually started to decrease, reaching a standstill between 39 and 44mm cases. I believe it's a good estimate, generally speaking, of the size of watch cases today. But lately, we have seen a trend where watches are shrinking, and little by little, we have seen a reduction in size. For example, the Seiko Samurai used to be 43.8mm, and the new version is 41.7. It's a reduction of 2mm, and I think many of you know that 2mm are 2mm. But why is this happening? Why is the size of watches decreasing? Now, we have stated that watches were originally elegant, because that's how people used to dress. But today, in fact, clothing is becoming much more relaxed. Few people wear suits, and in fact, fewer people wear watches. So from that point of view, it doesn't make sense for watches to become smaller. But as my grandpa used to say, money talks. And although there are large markets that still seek big and robust watches with large cases, there is a stronger market that is dictating how these trends actually move. Now, if we analyze how things work, what market would be the ones looking for larger watches? And I say this because of the size and height in general of their inhabitants. First, the United States, which is one of the most important markets globally. Maybe then some Nordic countries, maybe Germany, Sweden, Denmark. Countries known because men are very tall, but maybe they do not represent such a large market. And maybe some African countries. But now, let's analyze the other side of the coin. Who might be looking for smaller watches? To begin with, us in Latin America. We are not particularly known for being tall and robust, so you have almost a whole continent looking for smaller watches. But then you come across the Asian market. That is undoubtedly the most important market in terms of luxury watch purchases. And what is a characteristic of people from China, Japan, and all of these Asian countries? Well, they are not particularly tall. They are not very robust people. So the brands noticed a need on that side. So if the majority of the market, if your strongest market asks for smaller watches, what do you think will happen? Of course, the trend will adjust to what the strongest market demands. So in short, the Chinese and Asian market is so strong that if they ask for smaller watches, they will get smaller watches. Now, the second reason why watches are shrinking is because the gender barrier is breaking. Now, I'm not going to get into the issues of that today. Like, if you identify with a chair today and the plant tomorrow, that's cool. That's not my problem. But before, we used to hear the term of that watch is for ladies, that watch is for gentlemen. And curiously, that term has been erased. Before, it was not socially accepted for a man to wear women's clothing and accessories. But now, it is accepted and even encouraged. And we see more and more men wearing watches of 30, 29, even 24 millimeters. Artists on red carpets wearing latest Cartier. And I think this has several aspects. One, expressing yourself. If a certain watch speaks more to you, but it's smaller, well, who cares? The point is that you enjoy it. Number two, comfort. Undoubtedly, being smaller, watches are much more comfortable, more versatile, and more discreet. And this leads us to the next point. The trend in recent years has been the old money style, where people seek to dress discreetly, whereas before, it was about drawing attention to yourself, with brands and bright, shiny, flashy accessories. Now, it is completely the opposite. People seek quality over attention seeking. And if there's something that large watches cannot do, is be discreet. And finally, the biggest reason why watches are getting smaller can be divided into two factors. The first is the popularity of vintage watches. In the last 2 or 3 years, vintage watches have had an explosion in popularity. Cartier tanks that you could find for $1,000 before have skyrocketed to $5,000. It's crazy. Collectors are increasingly looking for more and more vintage watches. And surprise, surprise, they come across watches that have cases of 34, 36 millimeters. And this popularity that came in vintage watches leads us to the second part of this point, which is the growth of reissues. Obviously, the vintage market is very difficult because it is complicated to find a piece in good condition with original parts. And the vintage watches made in that era are very scarce, as they are the only ones that exist. And at that time, manufacturers did not have the power they have today to create millions of watches per year. Back then, they were lucky if they created 10,000 or 15,000 watches per year, and that's it. So the brands realized that the trend was going towards vintage watches and began to generate reissues. Brands like Cartier, Tudor, Tissot, Longines, all of the brands dived into their archives and started to rescue old models. All of us were surprised to see them returning to smaller sizes. Because if the trend marks it, it must be followed. It would be foolish to reissue a vintage watch of 34 millimeters and release it in a 44 millimeter case, especially if the market dictates something completely different. And finally, an extra point for the collectors who, while still sports watches, dive watches, chronographs were popular before, people started using them for everything. Formal event, Submariner. Wedding, Daytona. Which I think collectors got bored and tired of hype pieces. Before, having a Rolex, having an AP said a lot about you to the world. And I think it still says a lot to the world in general. But I think that for collectors and connoisseurs today, it says more if you have a vintage Cartier, if you have a vintage Universal Genève, or if you wear, for example, a Reverso, which are smaller watches, much more discreet, in my opinion and my personal opinion, because some people sometimes get angry with it. It says more to wear any of these watches than any other sports watch. But what do you think? Guys, 97.1% of you that see my videos are not subscribed. So if you like talking about watches and the market, please click the subscribe button and activate the notifications so we can keep talking. That's it for today. See you next time.